Hello and welcome to the Book Thing, and this is my top 10 classic horrors. What I'm about to share with you now are my 10 favorite... Oh, sorry, excuse me. God, it's a bit dark in here. Hang on a sec. That's better. So what I want to share with you now is my 10 picks for the classic horror books to read this spooky season. So the term classic is a bit open for interpretation. Some people would say a classic has to be at least 50 years old. Some people say it can be as young as 30 years old. I'm going to choose to say that a book that is 70 years old is a classic, and that is for my own vanity because I don't like the idea of something that was relatively new in my lifetime being considered a classic at this stage. I would like to preface this as well by saying this is entirely subjective. These are just the 10 classic horrors in my opinion and based on the books that I've read. So if your favourite classic isn't in here, that is probably because I either haven't read it or I didn't enjoy it as much as one of these 10. So at number 10, I have got The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. This is the story of Ichabod Crane and his encounter with the legendary Headless Horseman. This is a recent read for me, and I really enjoyed this because what actually happens with Ichabod and his encounter with the horseman is a lot more open for interpretation than I thought it would be. So there is an element of mystery, there's an element of ambiguity in there, and I really like that. It's nice and short as well, so if you're looking for something spooky this Halloween, definitely worth checking out The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. At number 9, I've got what might well be a controversial pick, and that is Who Goes There by John W. Campbell. And the reason that this might be controversial is this could be considered science fiction rather than horror. But, you know, if you're going to go down that road, I'd argue Frankenstein could be considered science fiction rather than horror. Who Goes There is the story of a group of men in an Antarctic research base who find in the ice what can only be the body of an alien life form. The alien thaws out, escapes into the base, and manages to start to wreak havoc and pick the men off one by one. If this story sounds familiar to you, then that is because this is the basis of the film The Thing, made by John Carpenter in 1982. Now, I am a massive fan of John Carpenter's The Thing. You can probably tell that because my profile picture is a picture of me attempting to recreate the poster from the film The Thing. Interestingly, I'd actually seen first the 1951 The Thing from Another World, which John Carpenter remade into The Thing. Now, that film, shares the setting of the Antarctic research base and the thing being dug up from the ice, but it's just a creature that's lumbering around killing everybody. John Carpenter's film elevates that. It turns the thing from being just this hulking alien into a creature that actually mimics the people in the base. So it induces this sense of paranoia and mistrust among all of the characters in it. And when I read Who Goes There, I was really surprised at how much of what John Carpenter did in his film came directly from the 1938 novella. It's all there. The fact that the thing could be anyone. The fact that it's virtually untraceable. All of the mistrust, all of the paranoia, that's pulled directly from the 1938 original. And it's that sense of paranoia which is why I like to consider it a horror more so than a science fiction book, because there is the monster, it is killing them, but they don't know who it is, and it could be their closest friend. At number 8, what list of classic horrors for spooky season would be complete without something from Edgar Allan Poe? And for this, I'm going to go a bit unorthodox, and I'm going to go for The Black Cat. Now, Trigger warning for anyone who is upset by animal cruelty, because there are some scenes in this book which are quite brutal and harsh. The story of the Black Cat is very much about the darkness within. This is a story about a man who begins to decline into alcoholism, and as his descent becomes more violent, he begins to upset and alienate the two loved ones he has around him, his wife and his black cat. This is a story of how the cat becomes almost the, pardon the pun, catalyst for many of his monstrous acts, but also is the cause of his punishment for those acts as well. It's a really short but really, really dark story. And as I said, if you have issue with violence against animals, it's one that you might want to give a miss. At number 7, just creeping in at being 70 years old, is I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. So I Am Legend is obviously very well known because it's been made into films so many times. So you've got things like Omega Man starring Charlton Heston back in the 70s, and you've got I Am Legend starring Will Smith. And it is effectively the story of the last man left alive when the rest of the human race has been infected. And again, many people might consider I Am Legend to be a science fiction book, but if you go back to the original book, I Am Legend is first and foremost a vampire story. This is the story of the last man left alive in a world of vampires. What Matheson does is he takes the traditional vampire lore, he works off the assumption that if someone gets bitten by a vampire and they become a vampire and then they bite other people, then they become vampires, then sooner or later the entire world population would be entirely peopled with vampires. And that is the world in which Robert Neville finds himself. He is living alone in Los Angeles. He is being taunted nightly by his neighbor, who still remembers who he is and is shouting for Robert to come out to him every single night. But these people, they are not the mindless zombies that we see in the Will Smith film. They are vampires. And what Matheson tries to do is he tries to unpick the vampire lore and see what might be an underlying scientific cause by it, which is where you start to get things like the virus being introduced and vampirism as an illness. That is what I Am Legend is about. So while there are science fiction elements, and while there's an effort from Matheson to bring as much scientific reality into it as possible, it is first and foremost a vampire story. And one of the last things I will say on this is it is worth it all for the ending. The ending is where you understand what the title actually means, and it is masterful. I highly recommend I Am Legend if you haven't had the chance to read it. Again, what list of classic horrors would be complete without H.P. Lovecraft? And at number 6, I am, again, going to go for a little bit off the beaten track and not go with something like At the Mountains of Madness or Call of Cthulhu. I am choosing The Shadow over Innsmouth. So The Shadow over Innsmouth is told from the perspective of this unnamed protagonist who is touring around New England and finds himself in the small town of Innsmouth. Before he gets there, he starts to hear about some strange goings-on and artifacts that have come from the town, and when he gets there, he manages to persuade the local vagrant drunk to essentially give him the backstory of everything that has happened in Innsmouth. And it seems like there is an involvement of this strange cult, which is not just to do with worshipping some weird deity, but also that changes the people themselves. He then finds himself stuck in the town overnight, in a town entirely populated by people who are concerned that he has seen too much. Now, Lovecraft, as well as a horror writer, was pretty horrible in his views of people who are, quite frankly, not white. And there is an argument to be said that there is an element of that racism that comes into Shadow over Innsmouth, but quite frankly, it kind of comes into all of his work to some degree or another. But if you are able to ignore that, what Lovecraft is able to do better than almost any other writer is instill in the reader a sense of unknowable and inevitable dread of something that is coming and something that they cannot stop. If you've ever played any of the Resident Evil games, especially Resident Evil 4, where you are stuck somewhere alone, trying to survive on your wits, surrounded by very, very strange people who may not be quite human, that is the sense that comes across from Shadow over Innsmouth. And again, this is another book that has a great sting in its tail and a phenomenal ending. At number 5, I'm going to go for a novella that doesn't get talked about enough, I don't think. And that is Lot Number 249 by Arthur Conan Doyle. Now, Arthur Conan Doyle is best known, obviously, for writing the character of Sherlock Holmes, but Arthur Conan Doyle as a person was quite interesting because despite coming up with a character as highly logical as Holmes was, Doyle himself was hugely superstitious and a big believer in the occult, which is why he's actually written some quite good creepy occult stories. Lot 249 is the story of Abercrombie Smith, who's a medical student studying in Oxford, and he takes lodgings in this house, and his downstairs neighbour is a man named Edward Billingham. And Billingham is an expert and a student of Eastern languages, culture, and history and folklore. And his apartment is very much full of the sort of history and folklore of the Middle East and Egypt and the Far East and things like that. But the most notable artifact in there is Lot 249, which is an ancient Egyptian sarcophagus containing an ancient Egyptian mummy. Smith and Billingham become friendly, but as time goes on, Smith seems less enamoured by Billingham. He doesn't seem to be a particularly pleasant person, and one of the things that seems to be happening is that people who have come on the wrong side of Billingham have ended up getting attacked, and it's not Billingham himself who's doing it, but there is a suspicion that someone or something in Billingham's apartment is doing Billingham's bidding and actually attacking Billingham's enemies. And I think you can probably see where this is going. This is one of the earliest pieces of fiction that is about reanimated Egyptian mummies. And it is creepy. It is fun. It's not too long. And it's definitely pretty overlooked when classic horrors get mentioned. I would really recommend checking out Lot Number 249. Coming in at number 4 is The Strange Case of Dr. Jeckyl and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. It feels like I shouldn't need to give an explanation about Dr. Jeckyl and Mr. Hyde because it has become part of the cultural zeitgeist. When you talk about a person who seems to have two sides to their personality, you refer to them as a Jeckyl and Hyde. It is ubiquitous. Everyone knows that Dr. Jeckyl took a potion and became the evil Mr. Hyde. But what gets overlooked and what is key to this is actually the title, and it is The Strange Case of Dr. Jeckyl and Mr. Hyde, because what this is as a story is a mystery. When you read The Strange Case of Dr. Jeckyl and Mr. Hyde, you almost have to put yourself in the mind of someone who knew nothing about this story and is reading it for the first time, because what unfolds is a mystery about the good Dr. Jeckyl, his friends who are concerned that he seems to be under the influence of this awful human Edward Hyde, and they cannot understand what hold Edward Hyde has on their friend Jeckyl. And as time goes on, Jeckyl becomes more and more withdrawn from the world, and Hyde becomes more notorious in the crimes that he commits. The fact that Jeckyl and Hyde is the same person is a twist. Robert Louis Stevenson was doing M. Night Shyamalan style twists years before they became popular. Any film or TV show where the twist is that two people are actually the same person, that all stems directly from Jeckyl and Hyde. It isn't spoiled by the fact that you know the twist, but when you read it from the perspective that that's an unknown, what you see is a really interesting mystery, and see how well Robert Louis Stevenson weaves it all together. Highly recommend reading Dr. Jeckyl and Mr. Hyde if you haven't read it, because it's probably not quite the book you were expecting. At number 3 is Carmilla by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. This was a recent read for me, and this is a vampire novel that was written about 25 years before Dracula, and yet it feels modern, it feels fresh. The story is from the perspective of a young protagonist called Laura, who lives with her wealthy family in Austria, and through a variety of circumstances, they take in this young woman called Carmilla, and when Carmilla arrives, she immediately ingratiates herself to Laura and the family, but strange things, there seems to be a type of illness that is spreading, and that illness begins to spread to Laura herself. This has all of the tropes of any modern vampire story, right down to the seductive creature who doesn't just want to drink the blood of their victims, but wants to seduce and have them as being theirs completely. It's all in there in this book, arguably more so than something like Dracula, which came later on. It is chilling, it is creepy, it is highly recommended. If you've never read Carmilla, I can't recommend it enough. At number 2, we've got the classic Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Obviously, this is the story of Victor Frankenstein, who has the ambition to create life itself. He reanimates the dead human remains into his creation, rejects that creation, and that creation then goes and is rejected by the rest of humanity, and then becomes filled with hate and exacts all manner of revenge on Frankenstein himself. I heard it said once that ignorance is thinking that the monster is Frankenstein. Knowledge is knowing that Frankenstein is the doctor, and wisdom is knowing that Dr. Frankenstein is the monster. And that is a great way of summing this book up, because this is about, as it said in the subtitle, a modern Prometheus, someone who steals the power from the gods themselves, the power of life and death, but does not take responsibility for his own creation. It boggles my mind that this was a story that was put together by a girl who was, when she first came up with the story, was only 18 years of age. And for a girl of 18 years of age, she basically created a seminal work, not just of horror, but almost birthing the genre of science fiction as well. It is a classic for a reason. The monster isn't what you think it is. The Doctor isn't who you think he is either. If you've only ever seen things like the Boris Karloff version of Frankenstein, this is a very different animal, and I think everyone should give Frankenstein a read at some stage. And a controversial choice at the number 1 spot is Dracula by Bram Stoker. It could be very easily argued that Dracula is not the best book on this list. It could be very easily argued that Dracula is not the best vampire book on this list. Dracula as a novel is flawed. It has many, many flaws, both in the way it's written, the way it's characterized. There are large swathes of the book where the Dracula isn't actually in it. There's just the aftermath of what he's doing. The plot contrivances stretch things pretty thinly as well. And it's not just because it's vampires. It's because everyone who has had any contact with Dracula just all happens to know each other, and Dracula happens to go to the places where the main characters all happen to be, even though they're already connected to other main characters that we've met. But here's the thing, I'm being this critical of it because I love it. And they say, no one's more critical of Star Wars than a Star Wars fan, and the same could probably be said for Dracula. And there's a couple of reasons I've put it for number one. Firstly, it's my list, and this is very, very personal to me. Dracula, I think, was the very first book that I ever read that was not aimed at children. I read it when I was probably 8 or 9 years of age, and it has been a huge influence on everything that I have read since. Aside from that, you cannot overestimate the cultural impact of Dracula. When it comes to TV and film adaptations, Dracula is the character that has been portrayed the most around the world. The only character who comes close is Sherlock Holmes. And despite its numerous flaws, it is a genuinely good novel. It is really groundbreaking in the way that it puts the story together from the collected accounts of all of the various different people, and it almost assembles it as like an early found footage film, and its cultural impact can just not be ignored. So that is why I am choosing Dracula as my number one choice. But what's your number one? Please tell me, of the classic horror novels that you've read, what have I missed off? What would you like to have seen on this list? What would you have chosen as your number one? Where would you have placed the ones that I've chosen? And have you seen something new? I'd love to hear your comments down below. Thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, and take care.